Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to put on our hats as theological detectives. We're diving deep into the source text to uncover how a very famous, seemingly completely disconnected Old Testament story actually solves the ultimate mystery of Jesus Christ's crucifixion. We're going to look closely at the evidence, connect the historical dots, and reveal a mind-blowing narrative that's been hidden right in plain sight. Let's get started. Section 1. Why did Jesus take the cross? Okay, let's dive right into this. Have you ever actually stopped to wonder why exactly Jesus was executed? I mean, the religious leaders were desperately looking for a foolproof reason to eliminate him. So I want to pose a question to you right off the bat. What actual crime was severe enough to warrant the brutal crucifixion of a healthy, young, popular teacher? What was the actual official charge that finally pushed the authorities over the edge? Well, to understand this, we have to look at how the different gospel writers documented the events leading up to his arrest. When we look at the different gospel accounts, a pretty clear contrast emerges. It's kind of like a giant puzzle. On one side, we have the Gospel of John, which really highlights the raising of Lazarus as the tipping point. The religious leaders were absolutely terrified that Jesus' massive following would provoke the Roman Empire and spark a devastating war. In fact, John 11:15 notes they thought it was better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish. But on the other side, in the Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the narrative points directly to something else entirely, the temple cleansing incident. According to the book of Luke, Jesus marched right into the temple and began driving out the merchants, quoting the prophets, "My house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." And the absolutely crucial point here is that this wasn't just a one-time outburst. The source text notes that Jesus was in the temple teaching every single day. He was continually disrupting their economic and religious system, which completely infuriated the high priests and scribes. This was the spark that ignited their plot to kill him. But just disrupting the peace wasn't quite enough for a death sentence. They needed a specific blasphemous charge. And they found it in a claim Jesus made, recorded in Mark 14:58. "I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another." As our source text highlights, this specific testimony about the temple was the decisive blow. This was the claim that made dodging the death penalty absolutely impossible for Jesus. Section 2. What exactly is the temple? Which brings us to the core mystery of our explainer today. Why would an empty threat to demolish a stone building evoke such a violent, lethal reaction from the religious authorities? I mean, to put a man to death over a claim about a building just seems extreme, doesn't it? Why was the temple so unbelievably important? To answer this, we need to leave the New Testament for a moment and travel back in time to the Old Testament, specifically to 2 Chronicles chapter 9, to look at the very origins of the temple's glory. Section 3. Legends of Sheba and Solomon. So this brings us to the famous visit of the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon. But before we look at the biblical truth, we have to acknowledge this story is heavily clouded by centuries of pop culture myths and historical legends. You might actually be familiar with some of these. There's the famous 1959 Hollywood romance movie starring Yul Brynner. There are ancient legends claiming Solomon and Sheba had a romantic relationship that produced a son named Menelik, who became the first emperor of Ethiopia. There's even a widespread legend that Solomon gave the Ark of the Covenant to Menelik, and that it resides in Ethiopia today, celebrated every January with festivals featuring replica arks. It's fascinating stuff for sure, but as our source text makes clear, this romanticized treasure hunt isn't what the biblical text is actually focusing on at all. Section 4. Crucial difference: Kings versus Chronicles. Now, what's really interesting here is how the Bible records this exact same event in 2 different books, with entirely different focuses. In 1 Kings chapter 10, the focus is heavily on Solomon's wealth, his immense wisdom, and his earthly glory. However, as the source text notes, that very wealth eventually contributed to Solomon's downfall. But when the author of 2 Chronicles writes about this exact same visit in chapter 9, the spotlight shifts entirely. It is no longer about Solomon's personal glory. It is entirely about God's eternal covenant with Solomon's father David. The author of Chronicles intentionally adds 2 very specific phrases that weren't in Kings. First, that Solomon was made king for the Lord. Second, that God loved Israel enough to establish them forever. So the crucial takeaway here is this. 2 Chronicles is proving that Solomon was merely a proxy. The throne wasn't about human capability or wealth. It was about God directly ruling his people forever through the line of David. The temple was the physical anchor of that eternal promise. In fact, out of all the mind-boggling wisdom, the extravagant food, and the perfectly organized palace officials, the biblical text specifically notes that the Queen of Sheba was most mesmerized by the stairway going up to the temple of the Lord. It literally took her breath away. The temple was the ultimate, awe-inspiring focal point of God's presence on earth. Section 5. Fallen Temple, Eternal Promise. But, well, history is harsh, right? If this temple represented an eternal promise and the direct rule of God, how did it hold up against the brutal realities of the ancient world? Looking at the timeline, we start with Solomon's glorious construction, which left foreign royalty breathless. But centuries later, because of Israel's rebellion, that magnificent physical temple was completely destroyed by Babylon. Decades after that, a small group of exiles humbly returned to rebuild. Imagine the sheer agony they must have felt. The author of Chronicles is writing to these returning exiles. They're holding on to this word forever, but they're just staring at a ruined temple and an empty throne. And this perfectly sets the stage for Jesus, centuries later, standing in the rebuilt temple, claiming he could rebuild it in 3 days. You see, the author of Chronicles wrote his account of the Queen of Sheba to remind those heartbroken exiles of one massive truth. God's forever promise survives physical destruction. Even though the physical stone building fell and the earthly kings failed, God's promise to David to establish his kingdom forever remained entirely intact. It wasn't bound to the gold and stone. Section 6. Jesus Christ, the True Temple. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what was happening in the New Testament. Let's loop all the way back to Jesus and his supposed crime for the incredible plot twist of this explainer. When Jesus stood in Jerusalem and said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up," he wasn't talking about a physical building of stone and gold. As the scriptures later clarify, he was talking about his own physical body. Jesus himself was the true, ultimate reality that Solomon's magnificent temple only foreshadowed. He was the actual dwelling place of God on earth. And this perfectly fulfills that forever promise we saw in Chronicles. Just as the angel proclaimed to Mary in Luke 1:32-33, "And he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." The eternal Davidic throne wasn't lost to Babylon at all. It was perfectly, eternally fulfilled in Jesus Christ. This is why the religious leaders were so furious. Jesus wasn't just threatening a building. He was claiming to replace their entire religious system with himself as the supreme eternal king. So let's summarize our key takeaways from this incredible historical thread. First, worldly glory fades, just like Solomon's incredible wealth. Second, physical structures, even the magnificent temple, eventually fall. Third, Jesus Christ is the true, eternal temple that can never be destroyed. And finally, the application for us today is to not be distracted by temporary, flashy, worldly achievements, but to make our own lives a temple, governed by the true, eternal King. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. Based on everything we've uncovered today, ask yourself, where is your eternal hope currently built? Are you building your life on fading worldly glory, things that look magnificent now but will eventually crumble? Or is your hope built securely on the true temple, Jesus Christ, whose kingdom will literally never end? Thank you for joining me on this theological deep dive. Until next time, keep seeking, keep learning, and keep your focus on what truly lasts forever.